am Hope Caldwell, the city's Chief Integrity Officer. Welcome to the inaugural Integrity Week panel, moving from corrupted and contented label to a model for ethics reform. My position was created by Mayor Nutter in 2008 to promote honesty, integrity, and transparency in city government. Along with my Deputy Chief Integrity Officer, Stephanie Tipton, we strive to eliminate the influence of political or financial interests in how the city conducts its business. Without our mayor leading these efforts in ethics reform, ever since he was a councilman, most of tonight's discussion and what I do on a daily basis would not be possible. I'd like to thank him for providing the tone from the top that is required. Among the many accomplishments of my predecessor, Joan Markman, she created the Integrity Works website in order to educate city employees, vendors, and citizens about the city's public integrity laws. We continue to grow these efforts and these outreach efforts, and that's why we created Integrity Week, to ensure that people know who to call if they have a question and how to properly report a violation. Most large companies, especially ones with more than 20,000 employees, have just one code of conduct. The city has 3 different types of codes that govern a multitude of conduct. There are mayoral executive orders governing gifts, outside employment, and nepotism. Then there's the city charter and code, which addresses gratuities, gifts, conflicts of interest, political activity, campaign finance, and lobbying. And lastly, there's the State Ethics Act, which must be understood when it comes to conflicts of interest and post-employment, among other things. That's a lot of rules. With all these rules, we should expect no scandals or corruption cases, right? Well, rules were created to prevent bad behavior, but it is up to individuals to understand those rules and abide by them. And a vast majority of city employees do just that. They do the right thing and have always done the right thing when it comes to the integrity on a daily basis. We work with the ethics board staff regarding financial disclosure forms and conflicts of interest and political activity questions, and then we also refer employees to them for advice and, unfortunately, sometimes, if necessary, for enforcement violations. My office also works closely with the Office of the Inspector General under Amy Curlin's leadership. I'd like Amy to discuss briefly how our offices differ, how her office has expanded, and how she has very good firsthand experience on what she's witnessed change here at the city. Amy?
Thanks, Hope. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Curland. I'm the Inspector General for the City of Philadelphia. Under Mayor Nutter, the Inspector General's office has grown from a small branch of the mayor's office with 3 investigators to a separate, independent investigative agency with 20 highly trained investigators, analysts, and staff. Our mission is to ensure confidence in city government by rooting out fraud, corruption, and misconduct. As Hope said, we work together with the Chief Integrity Officer because our vision is a 2-pronged approach to integrity. Hope and Stephanie on one end dealing with prevention and education, the Inspector General's office on the other side dealing with investigation and prosecution or termination or discipline. I can tell you that in 24 years, having worked as a federal prosecutor and 7 years working as Inspector General for the city, there is no doubt that the culture in this city has changed. We once had a very proud history of corruption here. We joked as a city about judges taking bribes from roofers. Newly hired inspectors in different departments were told openly by their supervisors that they could double their salaries by taking tips. City employees bragged that they were paid not to work. Federal prosecutors had press conferences where they said, thank goodness we are here to clean up the city because they are a mess and can't do it themselves. And entire units of departments, from revenue to L&I, were convicted of bribery, extortion, and racketeering charges. But now, I can tell you that just last year, a city employee immediately reported a bribe attempt, came to my office, and together with the federal authorities, we investigated and ended up convicting the briber. Mayor Nutter now sends letters regularly to honest city employees, thanking them for doing the right thing. Now, every year, we present an Inspector General Integrity Award at a ceremony recognizing the honest and hardworking city employees. Our investigations from tips from city employees have led to convictions of people who stole millions of dollars from the city. We've recovered millions of dollars from contractors and companies that tried to defraud the city and to disregard regulations regarding minority businesses. And for the first time in the history of City of Philadelphia, we had a debarment hearing, and a company was actually debarred from doing business with the City of Philadelphia. We are definitely cleaning our own house now, because knowing the rules and reporting violations, together with investigating complaints and dealing with the wrongdoers, are vital aspects of the changed ethical climate. We're cleaning our house and we're being noticed. Last year, the Inspector General's office received the National Public Integrity Award from the American Society for Public Administration for outstanding contributions to public service. I recently attended a national conference in New York regarding public integrity in government, and Philadelphia was recognized for its efforts. I believe that what Patrick Kirkstra said in the Philadelphia Magazine this summer is true. This is really the golden age for ethics in Philadelphia. I'm going to turn this back to Hope, because we're going to now move away from investigations and focus more on campaign finance and gifts and those types of rules.
Thanks, Amy. So why are we here tonight? Since 1903, we've been trying to get rid of the stigma we're the most corrupted and we're the most contented city. Thankfully, we've moved so far past that label that we are nationally recognized, as Amy said. And we are nationally recognized because we have more laws on the books than most other municipalities. And we have this two-prong approach system that ensures honesty and integrity in government. My office also interprets and provides guidance to employees regarding the mayor's executive order on gifts, which basically prohibits all gifts unless it falls under one of a very few stated exceptions. The city just proved that it was a leader in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania when it comes to gifts, because just last week, Governor-elect Tom Wolf announced the new gift prohibition for his transition team and future appointments that are very similar to the mayor's executive order. Then with regard to campaign finance, our reform efforts are being noticed nationally. The Ethics Board's recent amendment to the campaign finance regulation is just another prime example. The Brennan Center for Justice at the New York City School of Law wrote the following only a few weeks ago about the amendments that close the loophole in enforcement of the campaign finance law. Quote, "These adjustments make Philadelphia's regulation one of the most innovative in the country, for which the board should be applauded. States and municipalities should look to Philadelphia as an example of a strong, effective campaign finance regulation. And we hope that other regulators will follow the board's example to prevent campaigns and outside groups from circumventing the law," end quote. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like corrupt and contented to me. Instead, our new reputation of clean and effective government is growing. The goal of all of these efforts, and this week in particular, is to showcase that integrity is not just a Nutter administration endeavor. We are each responsible for ensuring that the reforms and initiatives only get stronger and do not disappear. We're here tonight to reflect on what has changed since the implementation of various reforms, but also what can we do next and what can we do better? With that, I'd like to finally introduce the panel. We asked this distinguished group of panelists to join us because we wanted folks from the outside who are on the outside looking in at City Hall. They have a tremendous amount of experience covering or being involved with the city and can give an honest assessment of what's working and what needs improving. First with us tonight is Christopher Wink, who is the co-founder and editor of Technically, which is a network of local news sites that is started right here in Philadelphia. We also have retired Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News journalist Bob Warner, who is now volunteering his time with the Board of Common Cause. Attorney Stella Sy worked in the city solicitor's office about 10 years ago and is now a partner at Archer Greiner, and she was also on one of the inaugural members on the Board of Ethics. And last but not least is interim president and CEO of the Committee of 70, Ellen Kaplan, who's followed the city's public integrity laws and advocated to improve them during her nearly 10 years at the Committee of 70. Before we get started, just a few last-minute housekeeping items. We'd like to take some questions at the end of the discussion, but please, if you could, just raise your hand, and one of the volunteers on the sides of the room will come over and you can write down your question. For those more technologically savvy, unlike myself, you can tweet your questions at #PHLintegrity, and that will get to me somehow. I'm not quite sure how. And for city employees in attendance, make sure you fill out the survey form for tonight's event. That will help educate us on what events we'll have for next year's Integrity Week. And if you have not filled out your online survey yet regarding ethics in more general terms, please do so. All right, let's get started. So I'd like Bob, Warner, and Ellen to discuss, in their opinion, what was the major turning point that led to many of the city's ethics reforms that are in place today.
Is this working? Can people hear me okay? I don't want to tell you stuff you already know. I mean, there's no question, I think, that the discovery of an FBI listening device in the mayor's office in 2003, just a month before John Street was running for re-election, was the incident that dominated the political discussion for the next 2 or 3 years in City Hall. John Street won re-election in part by refusing to provide any details at all on contracts and other things that reporters were asking him about. But City Council reacted to this by passing a limit on campaign contributions, the first time that had ever happened in Philadelphia, and creating what turned out to be a very strong board of ethics to enforce these limits. I think that's probably the most significant stuff that's happened in Philadelphia in this area in the last 50, 60 years since the city charter was approved in 1951. That's the easy answer to that. But I imagine most of you folks were around and remember that anyway.
I would agree with that. I think that the discovery of the bug was the turning point. And for people who may not know, there were 24 convictions that came out of that discovery, one of which had to do with a city treasurer who went to prison for 10 years for selling favors in City Hall. And I agree that that is what's the impetus for City Hall creating the campaign finance ordinance and also the ethics board, which was on the ballot in May of 2006. Of course, what I found interesting is the reaction of John Street when the bug was discovered. And he said that it wasn't the FBI, although I believe he knew at that point it was the FBI. It was, in fact, the Republicans and the Justice Department in Washington that planted the bug. So there were all kinds of misrepresentations. I think even Bob Brady said afterward, oh, I knew it wasn't the Republicans. So I think that those kind of responses also fed into the public outrage about ethics in city government.
And now, Stella, Bob had mentioned campaign finance as one of the bigger reforms that was created by City Council back in 2005, 2006. What do you see, what was the big thing that you thought is actually working with the campaign finance law, or like any growing pain stories you had?
There are plenty of growing pains, like any time you implement new legislation, or at least you have to come up with all the regulations, and people have particular perspectives on how these things apply, and certainly have an opinion. This is Philadelphia, after all. And we did take a lot of input in developing the initial regulations. And I think one of the things that Bob mentioned is how strong the board was. And I think internally, we actually had we had good leadership. Richard Glazer, who was the chair, was the kind of leader who was willing to listen to different perspectives, because there are many. I mean, even though one would like to think the statutes are not capable of multiple interpretations, sometimes they are. And sometimes they don't quite convey what you need them to say. And so the regulations were designed to help create a process for regulating that. And one thing about Richard that I really appreciated is we actually thought very hard about the prosecution and the discretion that we had to some extent. Although we had some debates about how strong we should be about it, I think the press was pretty pleased with it seemed, I remember at the time there were a lot of, I won't say compliments, it's rare.
We would have wrote those down. We had a lot.
We went hard, and I don't think it was designed to get the press's praise, but I think that it had that effect. And we were happy that people started to understand what was really at stake, and I think education was a big part of it. I think people understand. I have to tell you that one of my colleagues, who I consider a fairly well-educated person, came to me during the street administration when I was working there and said, my husband gave a lot of money to, I think he's a terrible mayor. I think he's terrible. My husband gave a lot of money to him, but he hasn't gotten a contract yet. And I said, well, I think that's the way it's supposed to work. But in any event, that you're supposed to go through a process, and you're not supposed to get a contract just because you give money. But in her view, I don't think she thought he was word corrupt, but she thought he was a bad guy for not giving her husband the contract. And so I thought there was some education, there's a lot of education that this is what we're trying to do, is trying to make sure government works for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And not only for the people that are in government, but the people that are working with government, right? Ellen, do you have
Let me say a little bit more about the Ethics Board. I think they did an extraordinary job implementing a law that really went totally against the grain of Philadelphia politics. Mm-hmm. The members were appointed, as I recall, in late 2006, and most of the candidates in the 2007 mayoral race were already out there and had been raising money for months before the board even existed. But they were able to step in, deal with a whole series of different stratagems that candidates had developed to try and get around these campaign finance limits. Shaka Fatah, for instance, had raised a lot of money from a small number of donors for an exploratory campaign, and thought that he could somehow slide that money into various campaign expenses that were clearly directly tied to his mayoral campaign. For instance, the expenses associated with renting a stage and equipment for his announcement that he was running. But the Ethics Board stepped up, really blew a whistle on that, and I think by the time of the mayoral primary in the springtime, they had cited all but one of the 5 major candidates for mayor, as well as eventually 8 members of city council, several labor unions, and so forth. So I think Richard Glazer and the other members of the ethics panel deserve a ton of credit for what they did. It was interesting, Mayor Nutter was probably the greatest beneficiary, I think, of that law. He had helped write it when he was in city council. He understood it better than any of the other candidates and worked harder to raise money in the small amounts that the law required, relatively small amounts. I mean, it's still permitted up to $10,000 from political action committees and $2,500 from individuals. But Mayor Nutter worked at it and got himself elected. He had a chance to reappoint Richard Glazer 2 years ago to another 5-year term as chairman of the panel and decided not to do so. So it's just important in all of this that we can have terrific laws on paper, and if we don't have really solid people enforcing them, it can be not so, the results will not be what you expect.
And I think it's important to remember that Chaka Fattah and Bob Brady and Dwight Evans challenged the constitutionality of the campaign finance ordinance in the fall of 2006 and tried to have the limits dismantled. Of course, Michael Nutter did not, having written the law. So the law was upheld, and in 2007, it was the first real test of the campaign finance ordinance in Philadelphia. And I think the Ethics Board did a terrific job under very trying circumstances, because nobody knew what was going to happen during the election, including the self-funder. Let's not forget that Tom Knox was a candidate in that election. He put about $11 million of his own money into the mayor's race. And then the question is what do we do when there's a self-funder? And then there came about this doubling provision. Well, if you put $250,000 of your own money into a race, then those limits double for everybody else in the same contest with you. And so there were the ethics board, I think you could confirm this, Della, were kind of making it up as it went along, and they're still doing that, by the way. I see Netta Masters here from the ethics board, and she can tell you that the ethics board, a number of years later, obviously, this is 2007, and now coming up on 2015, they're still trying to figure out how to close some loopholes in the campaign finance ordinance. And when we see some unlimited money coming into Philadelphia for the municipal races as a result of the Citizens United decision, the question is, how can we get more disclosure of the donors behind those unlimited dollars? And there is legislation that's pending in Philadelphia City Council to try to get more disclosure. It's been sitting in City Council for about a year and a half, and the Committee of 70 would certainly love to see that legislation passed.
I would want to also mention and note the staff, including Netta, who's here, Shane Creamer, and Evan Meyer, who was our first council that we hired. By the way, all the board members worked as volunteers, to say that we devote a lot of time to the city. But one of the things about Evan is that he was already trying to, almost like a one-person show, trying to promote ethics in the city law department. And I was there from 2000 to 2003. He was known as a council. We were very fortunate that he decided to join us at the ethics board. He's one of those guys who he said he knew he was the kind of guy that wanted to do this type of work because when he was in 5th grade, he saw somebody else's paper and he turned himself in. So he felt very strongly that ethics is a really important part of public service.
Right. Now, moving on from campaign finance, I think the next area that makes sense is the lobbying law as well, which also has gone through its own little growing pains time frame, but now has a lot of information online to search. I find it fascinating. Would anyone like to discuss that a little?
Well, I think the lawyers, once again, got involved, and if you remember the initial lobbying law, when they tried to implement it, there was some upset from the legal community because it somehow would interfere with their practice, their daily practice. And I think those hiccups were resolved and the lawsuit was withdrawn. But like anything, I think it's a new law. I don't think the ethics laws, as I understand, were on the books for some time, just were never enforced. But the lobbying laws are new. Campaign finance is new. Right. But the lobbying laws are new. And so I think it's a thing that we have to implement and live through before we really see how effective it is.
Right. And then, Chris, were you interested in commenting on that as well?
I mean, I think I would have to widen it a bit. So I'm not sure if you have another leg to the question. I can't actually see you.
Sorry.
So I don't want to jump us too forward. So maybe I can hold.
I'll stay here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would just widen when you allude to the online mechanism. So probably the voice I'm meant to add to the conversation. We're a technology news site, technically Philly. We help organize Philly Tech Week, and probably meant to represent some of a technology class that in some ways I hope can be part of that next leg of the journey. That Bob and I, Bob, you mentioned the importance of people being part of this narrative of integrity. I'm really interested in how you institutionalize methodology that can outlast the people that inevitably have to change, right? That all of you can't be the only voices or stewards for this. So an open data movement that's very near and dear to my heart and ties to a lot of open gov conversations. That's something that creating online processes where it's not just the future Bob Warners, the only ones who understand how to read and view what is and isn't happening in the city. That's an opportunity that I'd love to see move forward and love to talk about.
Right.
One thing we probably should mention is at least what I consider after the campaign finance limits and the ethics board probably one of the most important factors in opening up the government and providing some enhanced public oversight of how the government's operating is the new state public record law that went into effect, I think, at the beginning of 2009. Its genesis, like the city reforms, comes out of some scandals in Harrisburg. The law was proposed in early 2007 by State Senator Dominic Pileggi, who had just been elected to the Senate leadership after several senators and House members had lost their seats in the wake of the scandal over a midnight pay raise a couple of years earlier. And you were just starting at that point to see the evidence of bonusgate, the bonuses that had been paid to legislative employees who had taken leaves of absence to do political work. So that was all beginning to come out. The new Senate leadership proposes a public record law that, for the first time, really provided a mechanism where ordinary citizens or newspaper reporters, anybody, could ask for public records and get them within a reasonable period of time.
Right, Bob. What was the difference? Like, what before the new public records law in 2009? What did you have to go through as a journalist in order to get the information you needed?
Well, on financial records, the state law has always been pretty good at talking about the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, you clearly had a right to see any records of how your government at different levels was spending money. The problem was there wasn't a workable way to force entities to give you the information. You would ask for something, a contract that had been approved 6 months earlier or whatever, and there was no deadline for the agency to respond. You might make 5 or 6 calls and ultimately get the head of the agency on the telephone. You'd explain to him why this is clearly a public record, you'd like to see it, and he'd say, well, if it's a public record, then sue me. This was in an age when newspapers still made money, but we still didn't like to spend it all that much for what we thought would be unnecessary lawsuits. What the new law did was it set a deadline of 5 days for a municipal agency to respond to a request for information. And the possibility of extending that by up to 30 more days if it required legal review. There are 2 or 3 other items mentioned. It put the burden of proof on the agency to declare that a record was not public, as opposed to putting the burden on the requester to prove that somehow it would be. And it also set up a strong enforcement agency, a new open records office in Harrisburg that would be able to step in immediately if there were any disputes over whether something was a public record or not. So within 5 days, sometimes up to 6 weeks, say, the person asking for a record would get a determination of whether it would be provided or not. And if you didn't like the determination, you could immediately appeal to this office in Harrisburg.
Bob, over your career, did you find data becoming more or less accurate, or did you always kind of feel like what you got, if you got it, was consistently accurate?
I only had one instance where I had gotten a tip that the son of the executive director of the parking authority had gotten a part-time job in the parking lots down at Veterans Stadium, and he turned out to be the only part-time employee of the parking authority who was getting full medical benefits for this work of 3 or 4 hours a week. I made an inquiry about it and was presented with a whole bunch of documents where this had apparently been approved by the board of the parking authority. But then I had somebody tell me that all the documents had been created by the deputy executive director of the parking authority the week before. That was the only instance that I know of. And actually, this fellow lost his job at the parking authority for that, and turned up as one of Shaka Fatah's political aides, who recently pled guilty in that developing scandal.
It's still not always easy to get the records. I can tell you that if you try to get a record out of city council, it's you get a lot of pushback, and maybe that's just the committee of 70, but as you know, the city council is the only taxpayer-funded unit that does not make its budget details available online, and it actually took a right-to-know request by the Philadelphia Daily News to get those details. And it was, the Committee of 70 certainly asked for those budget details every year, so they're not always so forthcoming. But and the other thing is that I think that what you did, this has to do with records of things like the annual financial disclosure statements, and the city's forms just became available online this year for the first time. Otherwise, you had to go to the records department, and you better have some money with you, because otherwise you had to pay for each page you wanted to get for the annual disclosure statements.
But now, Chris, do you think you could speak a little bit how the open data movement kind of solves a lot of these problems, hopefully? In my dream world, like, yeah, the things that are public records, that don't have to be redacted, that don't have sensitive information, it should all just be on this lovely, beautiful website that we can connect all of the dots.
and I always preface that, you know, we're covering a community that is still very nascent, and I would actually love to hear Ellen and Bob speak to something we consistently hear, and you grapple with how much of that is true and how much of that is clouded. But the idea of workflow is still a challenge, and this is something that's happening in every industry. This is not a city government challenge of when you have 27,000 person organizations shifting over from paper processes going to digital ones. That's an enormous undertaking. That is. All the time, it's not, you know, a nefarious evildoer who's twisting his mustache because he wants to keep information out.
Right.
It is a real workflow challenge that has project management details that would scare any corporation. The dream, though, of any technologist who would be a reader of ours or someone we care a lot about, a civic hacking movement, is that, yes, that if we can position to agencies that this is not a combative issue, but an opportunity to save staff time. And when there are issues that don't have HIPAA problems, that don't have anonymized data problems, but can be out, and that's one less request for your staff, it's a huge opportunity. I'll say that we've definitely done some reporting and heard that open data has PR issues in a lot of ways, and we've heard them as far from open data seen as an efficiency that will reduce staff, will reduce staff numbers, and there's concerns about that. We've heard that in council. There's a real concern about lessening constituent. So there's a lot of issues that we have to work through. But yes, the dream would be if the city hall spends $1, you should be able to find out where that dollar goes. Not because it should be a gotcha experience that we so often have, but because that would make us all feel a lot more comfortable with what can or can't be done.
I just have to laugh because those of us have paper, and But maybe
I'm not texting, I'm taking notes.
Okay, fair enough. I am interested in this open data because having been at the city law department supervising social service agencies, we are very concerned about privacy and their laws, right? As you mentioned HIPAA, but there are other regulations. How do you prevent those things from happening?
So I think there are two things that interest me. That I think city as platform is an interesting idea. That there's a technology class. So right now, over at Drexel, I just left, there's 30 or 40 technologists hanging at Code for Philly, which is the Code for America Brigade. They're playing with data. It ranges from where that source is, but I'm sure that some of it's city-based. So there's a growing community of people who give a damn about the city, who care about how we visualize and understand our city, and would love to do something. They don't know or care about the legal issues that the city has to worry about. So that's never going to come from the private market. But the front-end experiences or the visualizations that will help us understand our community and use the data and resources that we all are collecting in all our departments and agencies, they're the front-end experience. That has to be the Chief Data Officer and the Director of Civic Technology, Aaron Ogle, is here. They have to deal with the privacy concern. So the answer is, yeah, that is the legal challenge. But what I was alluding to earlier, how do we institutionalize these processes? That is, we're doing all of the hard work now, and we should have real-time experience for what a budget looks like. And if we have to deal with the challenge of, does every city employee's salary get online? Does their department, is there a hierarchy? Maybe, but there's a lot of issues that I fully understand that have legal ramifications. So the answer is, you guys have to figure it out. I mean, the city has to figure it out. But it needs to be solved, because this is an enormous opportunity for it to not be held back by the city's legal department having to check what is or would not put out.
Well, how are other cities handling it, though? Because
yeah,
you said it's a very nascent stage that we're all in of this open data movement, but other cities are a little bit further along.
In different areas. I mean, I don't think there is that consistent, I roll my eyes anytime anyone has to point to San Francisco or New York as the only two examples of innovative things happening in municipal governments, because it's not true. I think a lot of cities in a variety of ways are having successes, and more important, the successes don't stay. Bob and I briefly were talking about, we also report on DC, and in DC, they were a huge leader in municipal government releases. In the Vincent Gray administration that right now is departing out, there were some real slidebacks. The open gov community, for one, didn't feel like that success was continued. There's a real question of what will happen with the next administration. So I think in some ways, Philly is really innovative. It has a well-respected chief data movement, that is respected in the civic hacking community. But we now see in other cities, that doesn't mean it's going to stay. So my answer to your question is, Philly is a leader in some ways, but I don't think there is a single leader, and my concern is it does not mean it's going to last.
Mm-hmm. Great.
But it's built on all of the efforts that, Ellen and Bob were speaking about, that we're not going to tomorrow be able to have the magical website you spoke about. So some of it's still right to know battles, some of it's still gift legislation, but there's a difference between rules that we have to not break and culture shifting by way of what becomes available to the rest of the world.
I have to say that there are incredible steps forward in terms of data availability. Looking from land use perspective, having served on the zoning code, I mean, right now you can actually access a lot of information. Anybody can do that, and about the current status of particular properties. And I think it's called GIS?
GIS.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a pretty impressive platform, and I think and one of the things that you can do a lot with social service data is disaggregate aggregate the data, so it's not specific to the individual. And you can do a lot of good policy planning that way.
Right. And one of the things that kind of started with the non-competitively bid contract law that Mayor Nutter, as councilman, proposed was getting that information online, making people realize who the contracts were going to, making sure obviously they weren't going to people who gave large contributions. And now we're trying to use that information to get it out to people, so you don't have to file a right to know request to find out who got the contract 6 months ago. It's already out there as soon as it's awarded. But as far as that law is concerned, Stella, from a law firm perspective, they had the largest growing pains, as I recall, back in 2006, and trying to adhere to the rules and really adhere to
the attribution rules are pretty large.
Can you?
The attribution rules. So it's a different from the campaign finance. But they use the same thresholds for what may disqualify you from getting a city contract. It's true for financial assistance too. If you want to get a loan or some kind of grant from the city, you have to meet these certain thresholds, or actually not exceed certain thresholds when you give contributions. And I think there was a lot of, again, upset, concern about how money that was contributed by a wife or spouse would be added to the amount that you're giving to a specific candidate, not remembering that in the campaign finance world, we all know that people try to funnel money through their significant others. It's historic.
Right.
So this is an attempt to address that. But I think people who are not aware of that history find it a little upsetting.
So do you think by now most corporations, law firms, anybody wanting to do business with the city gets it?
I can assure you that the threat of, for those who wish to do business with the city, the threat of losing that business is a very good way to keep people under control.
Mm-hmm.
I think they do get it, the big corporations and the big law firms, but I still think that it is very difficult for a layperson to understand those attribution rules. And let's not forget that when you have law firms, for example, and just so everybody knows with the attribution rules, it has to do with you may render yourself ineligible for city business if donations from certain people within the law firm or the company they're making donations to candidates, but remember that a lot of these law firms now have offices all over the world. So what can be a problem is, how do you know that somebody who's at your office in Tokyo isn't giving a contribution to Mayor Nutter, and how do you account for that? So in the big firms and the big companies, there are people whose job it is to keep track of contributions. So as I said, the companies and firms don't render themselves ineligible for city business.
What I think is fascinating, though, about that law is just how ahead of its time it was, because just given the latest scandal at the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you read the information about that case, it was appalling. And if they had a law like 1400 of the Philadelphia Code, it would not even exist. That's where people were expected to give campaign contributions, give gifts in order to get contracts. Otherwise, they wouldn't even get the contracts. It's just the complete opposite of what we've finally created here.
I think it is really important, and I think even Mayor Nutter, who I see just walked in here, would say that that the bug, which we talked about, really was responsible for a whole new culture in City Hall. You're the city's first chief integrity officer. Well, you're number two. You and Joan Markman, of course, was the first one, but Mayor Nutter appointed.
Seamless.
City Hall's first chief integrity officer. Amy Curlin, obviously the inspector general, and the mayor just reissued another executive order strengthening your office. So I think that the bug was responsible for a whole culture change with the attribution rules and the lobbying law and the campaign finance enforcement and the Board of Ethics, but really a culture in city council that said, no, we're not going to be doing business this way anymore.
I think we should hesitate to be patting ourselves on the back too much for this. Take Amy Curlin's office. I mean, Amy has been a real bright light in city government for the last 7 years, but there's been a bill pending in council for several years to make her office a permanent feature of city government and make the inspector general an independent official who would be, I believe, serving a specific fixed term and then would be ratified, or when that term ran out, someone would be nominated by the mayor and then confirmed by council. This bill has been languishing for years, and who knows what we'll have under the next mayor. Hopefully this will become an issue in the mayor's race to get some commitments out of the next mayor. But, you know, I don't know when city council is going to get around to working on this. Perhaps right after they sell PGW. I don't know.
Well, I think that there's a big difference between the culture of city council and the culture in the executive and administrative branches. So I think that the mayor does deserve a lot of credit for advancing a number of ethics reforms and creating a very different culture. And I agree, it's the fact that this Inspector General bill is sitting there. And by the way, the Inspector General bill would not, as I understand, at least in the last discussions, wouldn't even cover members of city council and their staffs. Even if it was in the charter, they would be exempted. And
So what are they scared of?
That's a great question. They're having a big fight about this out in Chicago because of course, the Inspector General in Chicago was also had jurisdiction over the mayor's office. And the last I looked, 35 of 50 aldermen, who are the aldermen, the Chicago's version of city council, have now said, you know something, if we're acting properly, we should have nothing to be afraid of. The Inspector General should have jurisdiction over the aldermen and as well. And I think that the Inspector General should be a permanent, independent position in the city charter with jurisdiction over the entire city government, including the row offices and Philadelphia City Council.
Absolutely. Stella, did you have any other comments regarding that or the?
About the Inspector General bill? I endorse it. But I also think that we really don't have an entity other than Inspector General who has that oversight over fraud and corruption in a way that they can actually pursue those investigations and do it in a way without interference from anybody else. It's not a political thing. I'm not like pushing you to do this. It's based on the facts or where the money takes you.
Well, and that's why I mentioned earlier too, that tone from the top, and they talk about that a lot in corporations. Like you have to have this tone from the top of ethical and compliance and things like that. And if you don't have that, it doesn't work. Like it really just doesn't, because then you're constantly worried about that. Oh, are you going to look into this guy or that guy or whatever it is? Any other comments generally? Because I was going to get to our final thought questions.
I just wanted to add along those lines around the culture. I mean, I had an opportunity to talk to some of the attorneys I worked with when I was at the law department about this ban on gifts for the executive branch. And it was right before we talked about...
Can I say that I kept thinking you guys were saying ban on GIFs, which animated GIFs, that's what I thought we were talking about. GIFs,
oh, GIFs,
just for the record.
GIFs, GIFs, no.
That's where I'm coming from, just so you know. I do not endorse a ban on GIFs, for the record.
We need an interpreter here.
Pro GIFs.
If you read our newsletter, we have a bah humbug.
I should enunciate.
My apologies.
Sorry about that. But I was just about to go to the hearing on the issue at the ethics board about how we would set a threshold or what the number should be for a gift and whether you should be able to get cash gifts. Unfortunately, I think the regulation came out where there are no cash gifts. And I think it was a legal assistant said to me, I love it because there is no questions. I don't have to worry if somebody tries to buy me a cup of coffee. I say, no, I can't. And I can just do my work. And I think that's exactly what it says. It's beautiful. I think it works perfectly.
Yeah. Great.
Are we ever done with this conversation? Is this just one of those conversations that we always should keep raising our expectations so we just always will have a next level to it?
Right. I mean, I think that's the only way to continue to improve it and to make sure, because I feel like there's always like the next challenge, right? Like you said, Ellen, the administration employees, I think everyone's really starting to get it. Like, and they like the ban on gifts. They like not feeling pressured by vendors or citizens or whomever it is. But that would bring me to, what would be the next thing? For each of you, what is we have possibly some elected officials in the room. I know we have one at least. But we also might have candidates who are watching on Channel 64 once this goes up. And, what's your advice to them on what should be the next big thing to really make Philadelphia the marquee place for an ethical government?
Data, which is like such a word that everyone hates using because it means everything and nothing at the same time. But full transparency in searchable, transferable, malleable formats online.
Okay, what does that mean?
Data that can be used and can be made a really pretty mobile application or a really great visualization.
So for people
online.
who don't know what data does, give Stella especially
like
fancy
Excel
example.
spreadsheets, like the most simple form, rows and cells in an Excel spreadsheet, at the most basic form, and God willing, real-time automated feeds into something like a spreadsheet. That isn't a scary thing. Because if we're doing what we can, they can make us smarter. They can save time. They can make us all understand the work we're trying to do better. And I think we see it in all these negative lights because it's been shoved down people's throats. But this is something that is not just an easy PR stump speech. It's also really a transformative opportunity because every industry, every private sector industry has made big data this phrase du jour. So of course that means it's not just a threat, it's an incredible opportunity. And I think city governments should recognize that there's every reason to be just as competitive. So I portray it as not a scary thing, but an incredible opportunity to do smarter legislating and governmenting.
Can you narrow it down to an example of one thing that you think would be a really transformative thing that whether it turns into legislation, like you just said?
So I'm really interested in Bob and I were also talking a little bit about crime data, right? Which is whenever we do any kind of research, everyone wants crime data. And Philly Police Department does have a very sleek website and short window data. Actually, really great. There's really great smart data policing that we report a ton on, really innovative stuff. But understandably, there's concerns about long historical data because it can show negative trends in neighborhoods. It can be a political hot button issue. But that for me is an example that you can't predetermine. Government's bad always in all forms at all levels at predetermining what the market will do with something. And could it have negative implications on neighborhood development? Maybe. But maybe it would be transformative in a way that we don't understand yet. And I think we need to sometimes. Anonymity issues I'm all for, but in terms of historical data, I think we gotta recognize that we don't understand how powerful that could be. So longer term historical police data is an example I think could be much more meaningful than we even realize. Right now I think it's 6 months is the longest window you can look at.
I think there's a lot of room for improvement in how the city deals with public information requests. For the last 2 to 3 years, it seems to me, there's an increasing tendency for every single request to be referred to the city law department, since no matter how routine it is. I mean, we've been getting city payrolls for the last 20 odd years, basically, digital payrolls where we can sort everything according to who makes the most money or what departments people work in, whatever. Our most recent request for that got referred to the law department. Since everything is getting referred to the law department, they can't deal with everything within 5 days, so they're taking an extra 30 days before we finally get the routine database that we've asked for. And the same thing applies to routine records, not data. Particularly in the wake of the building collapse in Center City last year. For a while, the law department was saying that because there was a pending grand jury investigation, we aren't going to give out any information that is conceivably related to that building collapse. This persisted until the DA's office weighed in and said, look, by announcing that we were going to do an investigation, we didn't mean to be suspending the public record law. If it was a public record before this building collapse, it's still a public record. things finally opened up after that, but I think it demonstrated the tendency of really any government to try and close down and protect information when they were worried that the records or the data might reflect badly on them.
But there's also a real liability risk there too, as well, I would argue.
Well, the liability issue or not, it doesn't change what the public record law says about what is a public record.
Right. Mr. Mayor, you had your hand up.
Audience question.
Correct me if any aspect of it's wrong.
It is wrong, and it's been reported.
I did the reporting.
I know. What you don't know is that we had a request directly from the district attorney not to release any information that was never reported.
So the DA's office was saying something differently to us than they were saying to the administration?
You'll sort that out. The DA's office asked us immediately in the aftermath of that tragedy not to release any information related to 22nd of March. We never reported that. We never said a word about it. We kept our word. And then there was a subsequent official allowance for us to release certain information. We adhered to what we were asked to do by the DA's office.
Might need a correction.
Well, it would have been nice if you'd told us that a year ago.
We were asked not to.
Interesting. Probably would help. No, never mind. While we're on.
We have this little,
Off record. That's what I'm going to say. Off record.
we have this little thing about keeping our word. We were asked not to by the district attorney. So we did. And we
They're asked to keep their word.
Well, I'm glad we have that on the public record now.
subsequently reported it was a letter saying,
Thank you.
The record now reflects.
So,
What I'd like to see is more recommendations that came from the Task Force on Ethics and Campaign Finance reform that issued a report in December 2009. I'd like to see more of those recommendations become part of the city charter and Philadelphia Code, and I'm going to give you an example. The task force recommended that anybody who works for the city who has a second job should register that second job with the Board of Ethics so that there's transparency around that. And I think that's important, as well as reporting that ties that anybody, especially at the upper levels of government, have to nonprofits. If you look at some of the headlines of misconduct over the last year, there have been numerous stories having to do with city council members, certainly Congressman Phila, State Representative Dwight Evans, and of course some of those are not governed by the city's laws, but reports of ties between politicians and nonprofits, putting family members at the helm of nonprofits that get state money, that get city money, and I think that those ties should be made public. And again, on the gifts,
a lot of that information is included on the 3 different financial interest disclosure forms that city employees have to fill out, whether it's the mayor's form, city form, or the state
mayor's
form.
as you point, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are 3 different financial disclosure forms. There is a state form, there is a city form, and there is a mayor's form. There are 3 different set of instructions. And one of the recommendations in the task force report is that there be 1 disclosure form, not 3, and not all of them. Not all of the forms require you to put information about ties to nonprofits. Right. And certainly not all of them require you to list your second jobs or the second jobs of members of your family. So there should be 1 form, make it easy, report it to the Board of Ethics, So I think I'd like to see that improvement. And on gifts, which you also mentioned, and this is a particularly sore subject with Hope and Amy Curlin and myself, because we spent several months battling this issue in the Board of Ethics when they were debating whether to announce whether to permit cash gifts of up to what was it, up to $50, and we're saying, what, cash gifts? Are you kidding me? I don't understand. I didn't understand it then. I don't understand now why anybody who works in city government has to get a gift at all. Not up to $99. Why do you need to get a gift at all? To me, there should be zero tolerance. You want to get obviously, if it's something small, a cup of coffee or something, everybody understands that. That's fine, but no gifts. That's what I would love to see.
I will accept all of your gifts over $99.
Under the mayor's executive order, you're not allowed to give your gifts to Chris. You're not allowed to do that under the state.
Tried. Sorry, guys.
Are you saying, Ellen, though, across all city agencies, not just? I mean, because the mayor's executive order on gifts,
well, the mayor's executive order doesn't cover anybody,
right? Exactly.
Everybody,
right?
But there should be citywide law covering everybody in city government. Again, the row offices and city council as well.
Right. Now, Stella, what's your dream suggestion?
So my dream suggestion requires the input of the state, which is I'd like to see the city of Philadelphia actually taking a lead, perhaps, in finding a way to institute merit selection for judges. Because I think that we have many fine judges, and we're very fortunate that we do. But the way that we select our judges, I think the biggest determining factor is actually ballot position. Ballot position, where you land on the ballot. Oh. There is some legislation, I understand, pending in the state where they would adjust the names by your ward so that you create a more level playing field. But if you're like number 1, 2, or 3, you're likely. Now we're lucky that some of these people ended up being really good judges, but that's really the determining factor. And I think too, putting that aside, the politics and that get involved in the judiciary, they shouldn't mix. Right. And one thing they did years ago, I was just talking to Amy about this earlier, we had the KC, we're trying to figure the number, 5 or 16, after the roofer scandal when a lot of judges had to leave the bench. Governor Casey appointed a certain number of individuals who then ran for re-election, and instead of giving contributions to those particular, they didn't raise money themselves, they had a common fund, so that lawyers could not give donations directly to the judicial candidates.
They would give it to like a pot, that would be dispersed among the candidates.
Right.
Interesting.
So we could talk about the issue, or not, and I guess you're not supposed to talk too much about issues when you're running for judge, but whatever you could talk about.
Right.
But certainly not about just raising money.
So we did receive a question that we have some time for from Twitter. It is, what must be done to implement city integrity or ethics policies that transcend changes in mayoral administrations?
So some of it's culture, right? Like, you look at business communities, which I think there's always great corollaries between corporate and government institutions. I mean, when CEOs transition, the only thing that lasts is lasting culture. So the expectation of so the horse of open data, once workflow is established that we're not creating paper processes, we're creating digital strategies, and the workflow is there in the agencies, my understanding of that's one way that happens. And the other way is as fast and as quickly as we possible, creating an expectation. So at some point, the Nutter administration making an executive order, some of that, some form of the outside community has now come to expect, and it's a whole lot harder to roll back in transparency. So I think getting as much out the door as you can, and in my sense, institutionalized workflow within City Hall, which is an enormous challenge, no doubt, and in my mind, scalable processes. So digital strategies, real-time feeds of data, workflows, L&I inspectors with tablets importing data that would then automatically be updated to a resource, that's a whole lot harder to break. You have to break something to stop that getting out. So institutionalizing the efforts and creating scalable digital solutions whenever possible, which is a workflow challenge, but is possible.
Anyone else want to address that question? Mr. Mayor, is there any comments you would like to add as far as your dreams for the city?
GW.
I'm just excited that you're having this Integrity Week. I'm really excited that so many of you came. The work that you and Stephanie do, and certainly Amy, I think goes back to what Chris said. We're trying to create a culture. When you talk about what Helen talked about, we should have a consistency of rules across. This is, we have a mayor, not a monarch, so hopefully dictate what other folks do. But I think all of us, as public employees, and certainly elected officials, independently elected, nonetheless, much like the ethics board, everyone in the entire government is under the jurisdiction of the ethics board. But the rules and regulations, there are some for the executive branch, there are some for others. There should be a consistency, not to worry about. But I think overall, this really is about mindset, it's about culture, and I think the most important aspect, it's really about the citizens.
Right.
If there is backsliding, the citizens literally have to almost revolt and say, we will not stand for that.
Right.
All right, so you set certain baselines of expected behavior, and then whoever's next, because there's always somebody next, they have to take it to the next level and the next standard.
Right.
So I think people should not, I'm not even saying in the perfect world, in this world, folks should not have to really worry whether candidate A, B, C, D, or whatever is for effort. The public has to demand that you're for that.
Right.
There's no expectation that any mayor is going to stop picking up the trash or stop filling potholes, or that police aren't going to show up when you call 911, or the fire department, or there's going to be water in swimming pools. These are standard things across the entire government. We have an expectation, and it should be the same
For ethics.
for
Yeah.
ethics and appropriate behavior in government. And I don't know why that should ever really be a question. I know why it's a question,
Right.
but it shouldn't ever be a question.
Right.
And it's the true protection of the elected officials taking an oath and adhering to it. But the citizens, the bosses, true bosses, demanding a certain level of behavior and never accepting anything less.
Right. Good.
Thank you. That's a great job.
And I think we have time for one more question. Amy, you want to? This is for you. Does the Philadelphia IG's office issue an annual report like a federal agency IGs do? I know the answer. I can tell them if you'd like me to. She does issue a fantastic, very, very comprehensive annual report, and it is found on their website, which if you go to www.phila.gov/OIG, is that, or is it, I think it's OIG. You can find the past 6 years or 7 years of annual reports. And then how do most of the Philadelphia corruption cases originate? Is it by the hotline?
I would say 90% of the cases come from tips from city employees. We also get information from the public, and we also, in some cases, on our own initiative, we see systemic problems with departments. But really, it's people who work in the city who are honest, hardworking people who come in and do their job, and they don't like to see their colleagues tarnishing their own reputation.
Could you hear that in the back? Okay.
How do most of those tips come in?
Hotline?
We have a website, we have a hotline, and people walk into the office.
Or most by the hotline? I'm just curious.
I would say the hotline and web.
You know what's really fascinating to me, and Amy, you and I have talked about this before, which is that the city has no comprehensive whistleblower law. And there are aspects of city government, for example, in the ordinance that created the Board of Ethics, there is their protection for whistleblowers. But isn't my understanding, and I think you and I talked about this, is there still is no comprehensive whistleblower law in city government. Is that?
That's right. Our new executive order that the mayor just issued has protections for whistleblowers. You can't lose your job, you can get your job back and that kind of thing. But there is no way for a whistleblower to recover money the way there is in other states and other cities.
Right.
And I think having that, it would be important because people know that they need to have protection if they come forward to report something.
But isn't there a new state law that provides that protection, and that would apply to city workers?
It does, but it's not strong enough. Really. The monetary penalties are not strong enough to, I think, really deter retaliation.
And then this last one actually ties in perfectly to this, is there a provision for awards for whistleblower tips leading to recovery? Which I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no.
Being a great employee, that's what the benefit is, right?
Right.
Service.
Well,
And the False Claims Act provides for treble damages, and the whistleblower can recover part of those treble damages.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for your attendance tonight and making this event a success. We were joking that we'd like to make every week one filled with integrity. Just has such a ring to it. But seriously, I really appreciate your attendance. And if you have any questions for us afterwards, please stay in touch. Please feel free to email us. The easiest way to remember is integrity@phila.gov. There's an email address. Our website is www.phila.gov/integrityworks. And we're really happy that we were able to pull this off. So thank you.